The rain fell in sheets, cascading down the skyscrapers like a curtain drawn against the world. Richard Caldwell, a man who commanded rooms and dictated terms, burst into the cramped confines of a yellow taxi, shaking off the dampness as he settled into the worn back seat. His tailored suit glistened from the rain, but his expression was far from regal. He was a king in a crumbling kingdom, and tonight the weight of it all pressed heavily upon him. "Park Avenue and 50th, he barked at the driver, his voice slicing through the sound of the rain drumming on the roof. The driver, a middle-aged man with a salt and pepper beard and wise, tired eyes, nodded without a word. He had seen countless Richards come and go, each one more arrogant than the last, but something about this one struck him. Perhaps it was the tension that radiated from the man's shoulders, or the clenched jaw that betrayed a simmering frustration. As the taxi lurched forward, Richard leaned back, fuming. "These city planners have no idea what they're doing," he vented, his words tumbling out like the rain outside. "They're wasting taxpayer dollars on ridiculous projects while the real issues, homelessness, infrastructure, are ignored. It's infuriating." John Whitmore, the driver, listened patiently. He had learned to be a sounding board for the many passengers who needed to vent. "It can be tough," he replied, his tone calm and steady, "but change takes time. Sometimes you have to dig a little deeper to find the solutions." Richard scoffed, leaning forward as if the driver had just uttered a profound absurdity. "Change? What change? This city is stuck in a time warp. They keep electing the same people who only know how to line their own pockets." John turned his gaze to the road, keeping his expression neutral. "And yet you have the power to make a difference," he said, almost as if he were speaking to himself rather than Richard. Richard's eyes narrowed. "What do you know about power? You drive a taxi. You're not in the game." The words stung, but John took them in stride. He had weathered far worse in his years behind the wheel. "Maybe not, but I've seen how lives can change when someone cares enough to try," he replied quietly. Richard rolled his eyes, dismissing the driver's wisdom. He was a man used to commanding respect, not receiving unsolicited advice. "Just get me to my meeting," he snapped, crossing his arms. As they navigated through the bustling streets, Richard's mind raced with thoughts of the impending demolition of an old property. He was at the helm of a massive development project, one that promised to reshape the skyline of Manhattan, but it came at a cost. He hadn't given much thought to the families who would be displaced, the lives uprooted in the name of progress. Suddenly, his phone buzzed in his pocket, a harsh interruption to the tension-filled silence in the cab. He fished it out and answered without looking. "Caldwell!" he barked, his voice sharp and authoritative. "Richard, we have a situation," came the voice from the other end, crackling slightly with urgency. "The demolition of St. Andrew's Orphanage is scheduled for next week. The community is up in arms." Richard's heart fluttered for a moment, an emotion he hadn't expected. "What does that have to do with me? It's just an old building," he replied, trying to sound indifferent. But John caught the subtle shift in his demeanor. "It has everything to do with you, Richard. That land is prime real estate, and your name is on the plans. The protests are getting louder, and if we don't act fast, then let them protest. We have the permits." "The city approved it," Richard interrupted, his voice rising. He glanced at John, who had suddenly tensed, a flicker of recognition crossing his face. "Richard, listen," the voice on the line urged. "These people aren't just fighting for bricks and mortar. They're fighting for their home." Richard hung up, the weight of the driver's eyes boring into him. He felt exposed. "What's it to you?" he snapped at John, suddenly defensive. "You know nothing about my business." John cleared his throat, his voice steady. "I know that orphanage. I drove kids there, picked them up for field trips. It was a home for many. What you call just an old building is a significant part of their lives." Richard shifted, uncomfortable with the unexpected turn of the conversation. "I've got no time for nostalgia. This is business, building a better future," he insisted, but the words tasted bitter on his tongue. John met his gaze in the rearview mirror, his expression softening. A better future doesn't come at the expense of the past, Richard. Sometimes you have to remember where you came from to understand where you're going. The words hung in the air like the rain outside, heavy with meaning. Richard felt a flicker of something he hadn't experienced in years. Doubt. The orphanage, a place he had long buried in the recesses of his mind, suddenly loomed large, casting shadows on the walls of his carefully constructed life. St. Andrews was just a place, he dismissed, shrugging off the sentimentality. That was a long time ago. John's gaze remained steady, but it shaped you. It shaped a lot of kids. You can't ignore that. Richard wanted to argue, to push back against the probing words, but something in John's tone made him hesitate. He looked out the window, watching the rain streak down the glass, each drop a reminder of the past he had tried so hard to escape. The taxi pulled up to his destination, the towering glass building, reflecting the city lights like a beacon of success. Richard reached for the door handle, his mind swirling with conflicting emotions. He glanced back at John, who was watching him with a mixture of concern and empathy. "Thanks," Richard said curtly, though the word felt inadequate. He stepped out into the rain, the cold air hitting him like a slap, and walked away without looking back, unaware of the connection that lingered in the space between them. As he entered the building, the warmth enveloped him, but the chill of the encounter remained. Richard Caldwell was a man of power and influence, yet in that brief moment, he had been reminded of a boy who had once relied on the kindness of strangers, a boy who had lived without the luxuries he now took for granted. And as the rain continued to fall, washing over the city, Richard Caldwell felt a flicker of uncertainty ignite within him, an ember that would soon grow into a flame, forcing him to confront the choices he had made and the man he had become. Richard Caldwell stood in his lavish penthouse, the skyline of New York City sprawling before him, a testament to his success and ambition. The glass walls reflected the city lights, but they did little to illuminate the shadows creeping into his thoughts. He had returned home from his chaotic day, still feeling the weight of his encounter with John Whitmore, the old taxi driver who had unwittingly unearthed memories he had long buried beneath layers of ambition and ruthlessness. His gaze fell upon a dusty old photograph framed on the polished mahogany shelf. It was an image of St. Andrew's orphanage, taken years ago, the edges worn and faded, capturing a time when innocence and hope were still present in his life. Richard approached it slowly, his heart pounding with an unfamiliar rhythm. As he examined the photograph, he spotted John among the other caregivers, a warm smile on his face, surrounded by children who had known nothing but the kindness he offered. A flood of memories rushed in. John's reassuring presence, the stories he would tell, the way he made the dreary walls of the orphanage feel like home. "Why am I thinking about this now?" Richard muttered, shaking his head as if to dispel the thoughts. He turned sharply away from the photo, forcing himself to focus on the empire he had built, the skyscrapers that rose like titans in the distance. Each one represented a deal, a ruthless negotiation, a reminder of the power he wielded. He settled into his leather chair, attempting to drown out the echoes of his past with the sounds of the bustling city below. His office was a sanctuary of success, lined with awards and accolades, but a nagging feeling clawed at him, an unsettling reminder of the man he had become. He opened his laptop, diving into business reports and financial forecasts, but the numbers blurred before his eyes. Images of the orphanage continued to intrude, unwanted and relentless. "Focus, Richard," he whispered to himself. But the harder he tried to concentrate, the more vivid his memories became. Laughter, innocence, the bittersweet taste of nostalgia. He recalled the day he had received a toy truck from John, the joy it had brought him, and how he had clutched it tightly as if it were the most valuable possession in the world. The thought struck him like a bolt of lightning. He had traded that joy for wealth, for power, and in doing so, he had lost a part of himself. "Damn it," he muttered, slamming his fist against the desk. The sound echoed in the silence of his office, startling him. He rubbed his temples, trying to ease the tension building there. He had always prided himself on his ability to detach, to make decisions devoid of emotion, but now he felt vulnerable, exposed to the very feelings he had worked so hard to suppress. The impending demolition of the orphanage loomed over him like a dark cloud, and he couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow his fault. The next morning, Richard arrived at his office earlier than usual, the sun barely peeking over the horizon. He walked through the glass doors, greeted by the familiar hum of activity. His employees were already bustling about, engrossed in their tasks, but Richard felt detached, as if he were a ghost wandering through his own life. He attempted to immerse himself in work, but the memories of the orphanage and John continued to plague him, seeping into his thoughts like ink in water. "Morning, Mr. Caldwell," his assistant Sarah chirped, handing him a stack of reports. "We've got that meeting with the board later today about the upcoming projects." "Yeah, thanks," Richard replied absently, barely meeting her gaze as he flipped through the documents. His mind was elsewhere, grappling with the guilt that gnawed at him. He should be thinking about profits and investments, but instead he found himself contemplating the faces of the children who would be displaced by his decisions. "Everything okay?" Sarah asked, concern lacing her voice. "Just peachy," he replied tersely, dismissing her with a wave of his hand. The facade of indifference was slipping, and he needed to maintain control. He couldn't afford to show weakness, especially not now. As the hours passed, Richard's productivity waned. He couldn't concentrate on the reports, his mind drifting back to John and the other residents of the orphanage. He imagined them standing outside the crumbling building, holding signs, their faces etched with desperation. The thought made his stomach churn. Finally, he pulled up the demolition reports again, forcing himself to focus. The stark statistics flashed on the screen. Projected timelines, costs, and the inevitable fallout from the destruction. But then, one image caught his eye, a photograph of a protest happening outside the orphanage. And there, holding a megaphone, was John. The sight sent a jolt through Richard, a visceral reaction that shook him to his core. Why would he fight for a place that was supposed to be long gone? Richard whispered, his heart racing. The realization that John had dedicated himself to saving the orphanage made him feel small and insignificant. He had leveraged every aspect of his life for success, while John had dedicated his to helping those in need. The contrast was stark and painful. "Damn it," he muttered again, the weight of guilt settling heavily on his shoulders. He turned away from the screen, feeling as if he were suffocating. He picked up his glass of water and took a long sip, hoping to wash away the bitter taste of regret, but it lingered, a reminder of the choices he had made. Richard closed his laptop, the decision made clear in his mind. He needed to confront this feeling, to understand why he felt so profoundly affected by John and the orphanage. He had to see John again, to grasp the connection that lay between them, even if it was fraught with pain. "Can you get me John Whitmore's address?" he asked Sarah, his voice steadier than he felt. "Sure, but is everything all right?" she pressed, concern evident in her eyes. "Just do it," he snapped, the edge in his voice surprising even himself. He softened slightly. "Please." "Okay, I'll find it for you," she replied, her brow furrowing in worry as she walked away. As Richard sat alone in his office, he felt the oppressive weight of his decisions pressing down. The city outside continued to pulse with life, but he felt like a ghost, lingering in the shadows of his own making. The orphanage, the children, and John were no longer distant memories. They were a call to action, a plea for redemption that he could no longer ignore. He leaned back in his chair, staring out at the skyline, but this time he saw it differently. It was not just a reflection of his success, it was a reminder of the choices he had made, the people he had sacrificed along the way. And as he pondered the man he had become, he made a silent vow to seek out John, to understand the roots of his own bitterness and loss. Because deep down, Richard knew he could not escape his past, nor should he want to. It was time to face it, head on. Richard Caldwell sat alone in his dimly lit office, the city's relentless hum barely audible through the thick glass windows. He leaned back in his plush leather chair, a glass of amber whiskey cradled in his hand. The alcohol burned his throat as it slid down, but he welcomed the sting. It was a distraction, a way to numb the gnawing regret that had taken root in his chest since his chance encounter with John Whitmore. He poured another glass, the ice clinking against the sides, echoing in the silence of the room. The walls of his office, adorned with accolades and photographs of smiling faces at extravagant events, felt suffocating. They bore witness to his success, but they also served as a stark reminder of the childhood he had left behind in St. Andrew's orphanage. The memories of laughter and warmth were now overshadowed by a creeping darkness that whispered of his past mistakes. He had spent years building an empire, but it had come at a cost. His humanity. He took another sip, and the liquid courage began to blur the edges of his thoughts. As he stared out the window, the lights of the city twinkled like distant stars, indifferent to his turmoil. He recalled John's face, etched with disappointment and a hint of sorrow, the moment Richard had left the taxi without a word of gratitude. The memory sent a wave of guilt crashing over him, forcing him to confront the man he had become. "Why did I let it all slip away?" he muttered to himself, a question lingering in the stillness of the night. "What have I done?" His mind raced back to the demolition plans, the families that would be displaced, and the orphanage that had once been a refuge. He had turned a blind eye to the human cost of his decisions, prioritizing profit over people. The realization gnawed at him, more potent than the alcohol he consumed. As the night wore on, Richard's thoughts spiraled deeper into despair. He recalled his childhood, the fleeting moments of joy he had experienced at St. Andrew's. There had been laughter, games, and a sense of belonging, however brief. John had been a father figure, a steady presence amidst the chaos of orphanhood. Richard had taken that for granted. With a sudden surge of emotion, he slammed his glass down on the desk, the sound reverberating through the room. "I need to fix this," he whispered, as if the very act of saying it would enable him to find a solution. He inhaled deeply, the air heavy with the scent of liquor and regret, and made a decision. The next morning, Richard awoke with a pounding headache, remnants of the previous night's indulgence lingering in his mind. He stumbled out of bed, the sunlight streaming through the window felt harsh against his bleary eyes, but amidst the discomfort, clarity began to form. He knew he had to find John, to apologize and seek understanding for the man he had become. He dressed quickly, a new determination driving him. The city felt different today, as if it too was holding its breath, waiting for his next move. Richard navigated the crowded streets, his mind racing with thoughts of what he would say to John. Would the old man even want to see him? Would he accept his apology, or would the anger still linger in his heart? After what felt like an eternity, Richard arrived in front of St. Andrew's orphanage. The once vibrant building now stood in stark contrast to his memories. The paint was peeling, and the playground lay in disrepair, a haunting reminder of the neglect that had befallen it. A group of former residents lingered outside, their faces a mix of determination and despair, as they rallied to save the place they had once called home. Richard felt a pang of guilt as he observed them, their passion starkly contrasting with his past indifference. As he stepped closer, he spotted John, surrounded by a few familiar faces. The old man's hair had grayed, and his back was slightly hunched, but his presence still commanded respect. Richard's heart raced, a mixture of apprehension and hope flooding through him. "John!" Richard called out, his voice trembling slightly. The crowd fell silent, eyes turning to the man who had once been their benefactor. John turned slowly, his expression shifting from surprise to something more guarded. "Richard," he said, his voice steady but laced with disappointment. "I didn't expect to see you here." Richard swallowed hard, the weight of his past pressing down on him. "I came to talk. He hesitated, searching for the right words. "I need to apologize for everything." John crossed his arms, studying Richard as if searching for the truth behind his words. "You think an apology can fix the damage done? You've made your choices, Richard. You've built your empire on the backs of the people you've discarded." Richard's heart sank at the bitterness in John's voice. "I know, and I regret it. I didn't realize what I was doing until it was too late. I've been blind to the suffering I caused. I want to make it right." The crowd murmured, uncertainty hanging in the air. John's gaze softened slightly, but skepticism remained. "How can you make it right? You're here now, but what will you do once you leave? Will you just forget again?" "I won't forget," Richard replied, urgency creeping into his voice. "I'm here to fight for this place. I want to help save the orphanage. I want to help the people who need it." John's eyes narrowed, still cautious. "You think you can just waltz back and play the hero? It doesn't work that way, Richard. You can't erase the past." "I'm not trying to erase it," Richard implored, stepping closer. "I want to face it. I want to understand. I want to help. Please, give me a chance to prove it." For a moment, silence hung between them, the tension palpable. Richard could see the flicker of hope in John's eyes, but it was quickly overshadowed by doubt. The other former residents watched intently, waiting for John's response. Finally, John sighed, his shoulders slumping slightly. "Talk is cheap, Richard. You want to help? Then show us. Show us you mean it." Richard nodded, determination flooding his veins. "I will. I'll do whatever it takes." As the crowd began to murmur again, Richard felt a wave of resolve wash over him. He might have been late to the fight, but he was ready to stand up for those he had once neglected. With John's cautious acceptance, a glimmer of hope ignited within him, a chance for redemption that he had thought was lost forever. Richard Caldwell stood in the gleaming glass tower of his corporate office, the New York skyline sprawling beneath him. The city hummed with ambition and energy, but today Richard felt an unusual weight on his shoulders, a heaviness that had begun to settle since his fateful encounter with John Whitmore. His board of directors were gathered in the conference room, their faces a mixture of skepticism and disbelief as he laid out his intentions to halt the demolition of St. Andrew's Orphanage. "This is business, Richard," barked Elaine, the CFO, her voice sharp like the edge of a broken glass. "You're talking about a loss of potential revenue in the millions. You're willing to throw that away for what? Some nostalgic memories?" Richard clenched his fists, fighting the urge to lash out. "It's not just nostalgia, Elaine. That orphanage represents a part of this city, a part of my life. There are families, children, people who depend on it. We can't just bulldoze over their history for profit." The room erupted in murmurs, the directors exchanging glances of disbelief. Richard could sense the disdain in their eyes, the whispers of weakness echoing in his mind. "You're letting your emotions cloud your judgment," someone said, a voice he couldn't quite place. "Emotions," Richard retorted, his voice rising. "You think it's easy to confront the person I've become, to face the fact that I've built my empire on the ruins of others' lives? This isn't weakness. It's the first step toward redemption." The silence that followed was deafening. Richard's heart raced as he glanced around the table, assessing the impact of his words. He could see the wheels turning in their minds. This was not the Richard Caldwell they knew, a man who thrived on ruthless decisions and cold calculations. This new revelation of compassion seemed to unsettle them. "Richard," Elaine spoke again, her tone softer yet firm, "we understand your concern, but if you proceed with this, you risk everything we've built. You risk your reputation." "Reputation?" He laughed bitterly, a sound that felt foreign to him. What good is a reputation if it's built on the backs of the vulnerable? If I don't stand up for them now, who will? Isn't that what the city is for? Another director chimed in, his voice laced with condescension. Let the city handle it. We're here to make money, not save the world. Richard's jaw tightened. He felt the blood rush to his head as he weighed his options. He had spent years climbing the ladder of success, and now he was facing a choice that could unravel everything. But deep down, he knew this was a battle he had to fight, not just for the orphanage and its residents, but for his own soul. I'll take full responsibility for the financial repercussions, he declared, his voice steadying with newfound resolve. We'll organize a community event, raise public awareness, gather support. I'll reach out to the former residents, the families that grew up there. We can turn this around. The board exchanged skeptical looks, but Richard's determination was palpable. He was prepared to fight for the orphanage, to confront the ghosts of his past, and reclaim the humanity he thought he had buried beneath layers of ambition. As the meeting concluded, Richard felt a surge of adrenaline mixed with fear. He stepped out into the hallway, the cool air hitting his face as he took a moment to collect his thoughts. The world outside was bustling, full of life, yet he felt disconnected, as if he were moving in slow motion while everything else raced ahead. Determined, he pulled out his phone and began scrolling through contacts, searching for the names of former residents he had stumbled upon during his research. Each name brought a flicker of recognition, memories surfacing like distant echoes. He had spent so long avoiding the past, but now it was time to confront it head-on. He dialed the first number, his heart pounding as the phone rang. "Hello?" a voice answered, cautious yet curious. "Is this Angela?" Richard asked, trying to keep his voice steady. "Yes. Who's this?" "This is Richard Caldwell. I'd like to talk to you about St. Andrew's Orphanage." There was a pause on the other end, a moment of surprise. "Richard? The Richard Caldwell? The real estate mogul?" "Yes, that's me," he replied, swallowing hard. "I know this might come as a shock, but I'm reaching out because I want to help save the orphanage. I want to gather support from everyone who has been there, and I believe your voice would make a difference." Wow, Angela stammered. "You're serious about this?" "More than ever," Richard replied, his resolve strengthening with each word. "I'm asking for your help. We need to mobilize the community, show them how important this place is to us. I want to organize a rally, get people talking." "Okay, I'll do whatever I can," Angela said, her voice tinged with enthusiasm. "I'll reach out to others, those who grew up there. We can share our stories. People need to know what that place means to us." Richard hung up, a spark of hope igniting within him. With every conversation he initiated, he felt layers of his past begin to peel away, revealing a man who cared, who wanted to make a difference. The fear of losing his empire began to fade, replaced by a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Days turned into nights as Richard tirelessly worked to rally the support of former residents and community members. He organized meetings, created flyers, and reached out to local media. Each person he spoke to shared their experiences, their stories laced with joy, pain, and the unbreakable bond they shared because of the orphanage. "I remember when we used to play in the yard," a former resident named Eric said during one of the gatherings. "That place was our home. It didn't matter how many times we were moved around. St. Andrew's was always there, giving us safety and love." Richard nodded, his heart swelling with emotion. "And that's what we need to show the city, that this is more than just a building. It's a symbol of hope for so many." As the pressure from his investors mounted, Richard felt a growing tension within himself. He was at a crossroads, torn between the ambition that had driven him for years and this newfound sense of purpose. The demolition date loomed closer, and with each passing day, the stakes rose higher. One evening, after a particularly exhausting day, Richard found himself in his office, staring out at the city lights twinkling like stars. He poured himself a drink, the amber liquid swirling in the glass, but he hesitated before taking a sip. Instead, he set the glass down and pulled out a notebook filled with notes from his gatherings. He closed his eyes, envisioning the faces of those he had met, the laughter, the tears, the shared memories. They were all counting on him to champion their cause, to stand up against the very empire he had built. "Am I really willing to risk it all?" he muttered to himself, grappling with the enormity of the decision he faced. The phone buzzed on his desk, breaking his reverie. It was a message from John Whitmore, the taxi driver who had unwittingly awakened his conscience. "Richard, I heard about the rally. I'm proud of you. Let's talk soon." A flicker of warmth spread through Richard. Maybe this was the connection he needed, a reminder that he wasn't alone in this fight. Resolute, he stood up, determination coursing through his veins. He would gather the strength to face the impending challenges, to reclaim not just the orphanage, but also the parts of himself he had long buried. With his past in mind and hope in his heart, Richard Caldwell was ready to embark on the most significant battle of his life, a battle for redemption, for community, and ultimately for the boy he once was. The morning sun cast a harsh light over the crumbling facade of St. Andrew's Orphanage, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like a spectre of lost childhoods. Richard Caldwell stood at the forefront of a gathering crowd, the rumble of heavy machinery ominously close behind him. His heart raced, a mix of adrenaline and fear coursing through his veins. Today was the day he would either solidify his legacy as a merciless real estate mogul or redefine himself entirely. Flanked by supporters, former residents of the orphanage, community advocates, and a handful of journalists, Richard felt a strange sense of unity. The old building, with its chipped paint and broken windows, embodied not just memories of his childhood, but the dreams and aspirations of countless others who had once called it home. It was a symbol of hope, a refuge that had nurtured the lost and the abandoned. Now it stood on the precipice of destruction, a casualty of Richard's own ambition. As he gazed at the machinery poised to demolish the orphanage, he felt the weight of his choices pressing down on him like a leaden cloak. "Mr. Caldwell!" a voice called out, cutting through the murmur of the crowd. It was John Whitmore, the taxi driver whose unexpected connection to Richard had ignited a spark of remorse within him. John approached, his face a mixture of determination and disappointment. "Are you really going to let this happen?" Richard clenched his fists, his jaw tightening. "I'm doing everything I can, John. I'm fighting for this place." "Fighting? Or are you just playing at being a savior?" John's voice dripped with skepticism. "You had the power to stop this long before it got to this point." "I didn't realize what this place meant until it was almost too late," Richard admitted, his voice strained. "I've been blind and I'm trying to make it right, I really am." "Trying isn't enough," John said firmly. "You need to stand up and show them what you really believe in. Otherwise, this will just be another chapter in your empire, built on the backs of the vulnerable." Richard swallowed hard, his thoughts racing. He had built his life on a foundation of ruthlessness, but now, in front of the very people he had wronged, he felt exposed. "What do you want me to do? Just stand here and let them take it down?" "No," John replied, his eyes burning with conviction. "I want you to show them you're not the man they think you are. You need to speak out, Richard. You need to tell them why this place matters to you." The crowd began to murmur, and Richard sensed the tension in the air thickening like storm clouds. He took a deep breath and stepped back, trying to gather his thoughts. Would he really be able to do this? The thought of baring his soul in front of so many people sent a shiver down his spine. Yet deep within him, a flicker of courage ignited. As he moved towards the front of the gathering, the cameras began to roll. Reporters adjusted their equipment, eager to capture the moment. Richard's heart pounded in his chest, each beat echoing the memories of laughter and love that once filled the orphanage. He had to be strong. He had to be honest. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice trembling slightly, "thank you for being here today. I know many of you are wondering why I, Richard Caldwell, stand in front of you, a man who has spent years building an empire on real estate, now trying to save this orphanage. He paused, the weight of his confession hanging in the air. This place, St. Andrews, was my home. It was a refuge for me when I had nowhere else to go. It was here that I learned about kindness, about community, about what it means to have a family, even if it wasn't a traditional one. The crowd listened intently, their expressions shifting from skepticism to empathy. Richard continued, "I was just a child, lost and afraid. But the people here, like John, showed me that love could exist in the most unexpected places. I owe my life to this orphanage and to the people who cared for me when no one else would." He looked directly at John, who stood among the crowd, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. "I've spent years building walls around my heart, thinking that power and wealth could fill the emptiness inside me. But I've come to realize that true strength lies not in what we possess, but in what we choose to protect and nurture." Richard's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "Today I ask you all to join me in saving St. Andrews, not just for the memories it holds, but for the countless children who still need a place to call home. We cannot let greed dictate the fate of our future. We must stand together and fight for those who cannot fight for themselves." As he spoke, the energy in the crowd shifted. Murmurs of agreement rippled through the audience, and Richard could see faces soften, hearts beginning to open. He felt something shift within himself too, as if the barriers he had erected for so long were finally beginning to crumble. "Together, we can make a difference," he urged. "We can show the city that we will not allow our past to be bulldozed into oblivion. We will not be silent. We will not back down." The roar of applause erupted from the crowd, drowning out the sounds of machinery. Richard's security team shifted uneasily, sensing the tide of public opinion turning against them. Richard stood firm, emboldened by the support around him, feeling a sense of fulfillment he had never known before. As the applause faded, Richard caught John's eye once more. The older man nodded, a subtle yet powerful gesture of approval. In that moment, Richard understood the true meaning of redemption. It was not simply about making amends for the past, but about actively choosing to forge a new path forward, one that honored both his history and the future of those who had once shared it with him. With a newfound resolve, Richard turned back toward the crowd. "Let's show the city what we can do when we stand together. Let's save St. Andrew's orphanage." The chant began to rise, echoing through the streets, a rallying cry for change. Richard could feel the weight of his empire pressing down on him, threatening to crush him under the expectations of investors and board members who would see his actions as a betrayal. But for the first time, he felt a sense of purpose that transcended profits and power. He was no longer just a businessman. He was a man on a mission to reclaim a part of himself that had long been buried beneath ambition and greed. As the crowd surged forward, Richard allowed himself to feel hope, a fragile yet persistent flicker that ignited a fire within him. Today was not just about saving a building, it was about saving himself and honoring the legacy of those who had shaped him. And as the machinery stood silent for now, Richard Caldwell found himself standing on the precipice of a new beginning, ready to embrace whatever came next. Months had passed since the tumultuous day of the demolition, a day that had forever altered Richard Caldwell's trajectory. The once imposing structure of St. Andrew's Orphanage had been transformed into a vibrant community centre. Bright banners hung from the newly painted walls, and laughter echoed across the playground where children now played freely. Richard stood at the front of the centre, his heart swelling with a mix of pride and humility. He had sacrificed much of his business empire to fund this project, yet the sense of purpose it brought him was invaluable. As he surveyed the crowd, Richard felt a warmth envelop him. Former residents of the orphanage had gathered, their faces a tapestry of hope and gratitude. They had come together to celebrate not just the opening of a building, but the revival of a community that had once been forgotten. Richard stepped up to the podium, feeling the weight of their gazes upon him. He cleared his throat, the microphone amplifying his nervousness. "Thank you all for being here today," Richard began, his voice steady yet emotional. "This community center represents a second chance, not just for the building that once stood here, but for all of us. It is a testament to resilience, to the power of love and hope." He paused, glancing at John Whitmore, standing at the edge of the crowd, his expression a mix of pride and encouragement. Richard continued, "I once thought that success was measured by wealth and power, but I've learned that true success lies in how we impact the lives of others." The crowd erupted in applause, but Richard's gaze remained fixed on John. There was a silent understanding between them, a bond forged through shared history and pain. After the speech, Richard stepped down, feeling lighter than he had in years. As he made his way through the crowd, people reached out to him, thanking him for his efforts, for the community center that would provide hope and resources to so many. "Richard!" John's voice cut through the noise, and Richard turned to see the old taxi driver approaching him, a proud smile lighting up his weathered face. "John," Richard greeted, his voice filled with warmth, "I couldn't have done this without you. Your support meant everything." John chuckled, a sound filled with affection. "You always had it in you, Richard. You just needed to find your way back to it." He paused, studying Richard's face, as if searching for something beneath the surface. "I've seen a lot of young men come and go, but you've changed." "Have I?" Richard asked, a hint of disbelief in his tone. "I mean, I did what I thought was right, but I lost so much along the way." "Sometimes losing things opens up space for what truly matters," John replied, his voice steady. "You've gained purpose, connection, and a chance to make a difference. Don't underestimate that." Richard nodded slowly. "You're right. I've never felt this fulfilled before." He looked out at the community center, the laughter of children ringing in his ears, and for a moment, he was at peace. "I'm grateful for everything you did for me, John. You were a father to me when I needed one most." John's expression softened, and he placed a hand on Richard's shoulder. "You're a good man, Richard. Just remember the boy you used to be. Don't lose sight of that." As they exchanged these words, the atmosphere was thick with unspoken emotions. John shifted slightly, his eyes searching Richard's. "There's something else I need to tell you," he said, his voice low and serious. Richard felt a knot form in his stomach. "What is it?" John took a deep breath, glancing around to ensure their conversation remained private. "It's about your past, about who you are." Richard's heart raced. "What do you mean?" Before John could respond, he hesitated, his eyes clouded with a mixture of fear and resolve. "Richard, I need you to understand that I didn't just care for you at the orphanage. I've carried this burden for years, and it's time you know the truth." Richard's brow furrowed in confusion. "What truth?" "Richard, I'm your father," John said, his voice barely above a whisper. The words hung in the air, a heavy silence enveloping them as Richard processed the revelation. His mind raced, memories flooding back, faded images of a man's face, a sense of loss that had always lingered. "What? No. That can't be. You gave me up." "I did," John admitted, his gaze unwavering. "I was young, scared, and I wanted a better life for you. I thought that leaving you at St. Andrews was the best choice I could make. I hoped you'd find a family that could give you everything I couldn't." Richard staggered back slightly, the world around him spinning. You left me." The betrayal cut deep, a wound he hadn't known existed. "Why didn't you ever come back?" "I tried," John said, his voice thick with emotion, "but I was afraid that I'd ruin your life, afraid that I'd only bring you pain. The truth is, losing you was the hardest decision I ever made." Richard's heart raced, anger and confusion battling within him. He took a step back, needing space to process the depth of this revelation. "How can you stand there and say you did it for me? You abandoned me." "I know," John replied, tears brimming in his eyes, "and I've regretted it every day. But I've watched you grow from a distance, and I've always hoped you'd find happiness. I came back to help save the orphanage because I needed to make amends. I wanted to show you that I was still here, still caring." The weight of John's words crashed over Richard, and he felt tears begin to fill his eyes. The man who had once been a ghost in his life was now standing before him, raw and vulnerable. "I don't know what to say. Just know that I love you," John said, his voice breaking. "I always have, and I'm proud of the man you've become." In that moment, Richard felt the walls he had built around his heart begin to crumble. The anger, the resentment, it all felt so insignificant compared to the overwhelming desire for connection. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them, and for the first time in his life, he embraced the man who had given him life. As they held each other, tears fell freely, mingling with the laughter of children nearby. Richard felt an unfamiliar sense of peace wash over him, filling the void he had carried for so long. In that embrace, he found not only a father, but also a piece of himself he thought he had lost forever. The journey to redemption was far from over, but for the first time, Richard felt ready to face it, hand in hand with the man who had shaped his past and perhaps his future too.